Welcome to Heartbreak Revealed. Discover real stories of wives' betrayals and shocking twists. Hit subscribe button and let's get to our story. I sat down at my desk, glanced at my watch a few minutes before 6 p.m. In about an hour, I'd head home to start the weekend. I always looked forward to weekends, but this one was special. Tomorrow, Sunday, marked 15 years since I married Susan, and I couldn't wait to take her away for the weekend to have some wild fun at the mountain cabin I'd booked. I took a photo of Susan from my desk and looked at it closely. It was a picture she gave me years ago, inscribed with, "The love of my life." By the way, I am Jim Wilson. Susan and I fell in love in college and got married right after graduation. She insisted we wait until our wedding night to have sex, saying it would make our honeymoon better. She was right. My parents were thrilled and gave me a check for $80,000 and the keys to a townhouse they rented out. "Just to get started," my dad said. This money, he explained, was the first installment of a $5 million trust fund set up shortly after I was born. I'd receive a similar amount every year. My mom passed away shortly after I was born. My dad never talked about her, and I didn't press him. About a year after her death, he remarried the woman I knew as Mom. I considered joining the military after high school, but was rejected because I had diabetes, managed through diet and pills. Despite this, I still played soccer and took martial arts classes. Susan and I went to college together. She wanted to be a teacher, and I aimed to follow my dad into business. Our plans changed when Susan got pregnant with our son, Eric, 6 months after our wedding. Susan had a tough delivery, and on the doctor's advice, she had her tubes tied afterward. She took time off college to care for Eric and returned after he started kindergarten. She got her teaching certificate and began working at a local school. Meanwhile, I graduated and went to work for Harris Industries as an accountant. I remember the day I told my dad about my job. "Harris Industries, right?" he asked. Harris Industries had been in business for almost 40 years and was a very well-established manufacturing and logistics company. They had a huge customer base across the country and an impressive portfolio with great potential for growth. "Yes," I told him, "they start with the fact that I work as an accountant. Good salary and benefits are amazing." "Fine. I'm proud of you, son," he said. "I hope everything works out for you." I remember being somewhat taken aback by the way he made his comment. I could tell that although he was proud of me, something else was bothering him. I wanted to ask him about this, but I restrained myself. My father wasn't the type to volunteer more information than necessary, and I knew pestering him about it would get me nowhere. The next 12 years were what you might call normal. We worked, came home, took care of our family. Lather, rinse, repeat. My job didn't require any travel except for the occasional seminar, but we took time out for annual vacations, usually during the summer months when Susan didn't have to work. I stopped taking martial arts classes about 5 years after I got married due to lack of time. I think raising a child in addition to working and taking care of the home tends to lead to this. I didn't talk about my job very often, but my father suggested several times that I explore my options. I couldn't help but wonder why he suggested this, but I dropped the subject. Overall, Susan and I were happy. Of course, we had our ups and downs like every married couple, but overall, everything was fine. Our personal life was fairly stable, but declined a bit as we got older. However, about a month ago, I began to notice some changes in Susan. At first, I chalked it up to the fact that school was over, and she didn't have to go to work every day. She had periods when she became withdrawn and distant. A few times, she got a little harsh with me. I couldn't understand what I had done and tried to talk to her about it. She simply waved me off with a wave of her hand before walking away. A little later, she returned, apologizing for her behavior. Around this time, I learned that I was being considered for the vice president position that had just opened up. I was told that I was one of 2 people applying for this position. I later learned that the other candidate being considered was Mark Johnson. Mark was a good man who deserved a promotion, but I thought I was better suited for the job. I didn't tell anyone about the promotion, deciding to wait until I knew for sure one way or another, so I didn't think it had anything to do with it. Then it dawned on me. Everything in the house was changing. Eric had just graduated from high school and received an appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. In fact, he was on his way there now. Perhaps, I thought, she was worried about the idea of becoming lonely. That's when I came up with the idea for a weekend away to celebrate our anniversary. I decided to surprise her, hoping that it would bring her out of her stupor. The phone on my desk rang at 4:45, bringing me back to reality. I picked up the phone and was greeted by the voice of my secretary. "Mr. Wilson," she said, "Mr. Turner just called and said you need to meet him as soon as possible." "Thank you, Sarah," I said. Jacob Turner III, or Jake as he liked to be called, was the CEO of Harris, and when he demanded your presence, you didn't keep him waiting. I decided that he wanted to talk to me about the promotion. I stood up, looked in the bathroom mirror, straightened my tie, and headed to the elevator. On the way up, I pulled my smartphone out of my pants pocket and set the audio recording function to record for an hour just in case. I always did this when I went into meetings for later review, just in case I missed something important. I put the phone back in my pocket just as the elevator stopped. I got off on the 14th floor, the floor that housed all of the company's top executives, and headed to Turner's suite, which occupied most of one end of the floor. His assistant, an attractive brunette named Brenda Harris, looked up at me as I entered. "Mr. Turner is expecting you, Mr. Wilson," she said with a slight grin. I wondered what caused that smirk. "Come on in." I nodded my head and opened the double doors to Turner's main office. "Oh, Jim, come in," he said with a smile, inviting me inside. I walked in and sat down in the chair he indicated, which stood directly opposite the sofa and coffee table set up at one end of the office. "Get Mr. Wilson something to drink, Frank," he ordered, looking at the large man in the suit. I knew that Frank Brown was one of Jake's personal guards, and I wondered where the other guard was. Turner always kept 2 guards with him for some reason that escaped me. I've heard rumors over the years, but none of them have ever been confirmed. Frank poured some bourbon into a glass and handed it to me. I didn't drink very often, but Frank knew that I preferred straight bourbon, just like my father. I accepted the glass and thanked him. Frank nodded his head but didn't say anything or even smile. Come to think of it, I don't think I've ever seen this man smile. Turner walked over to the sofa and sat down. I noticed that he had taken off his jacket and rolled up the sleeves of his shirt. Turner was a large man with a barrel chest and muscles. I thought he looked good for being over 50 years old. He took a sip of his drink, then set it on the coffee table and regarded me for a moment before speaking. "Go on," he said with a smile. "Drink something. It won't kill you if you relax a little." I took a test sip of the bourbon before placing the glass on the coaster he had on the coffee table. "Thank you," I said. "What can I do for you today, Mr. Turner?" Jake smiled before saying anything. "That's what I like best about you, Jim," he said. "Always so polite, always so kind. I was telling Brenda a couple of days ago that I don't think I've ever seen you worry about anything. By the way, how are things going on the home front? Is everything okay between you and your wife?" I nodded my head. "Yes, everything is fine," I said. "Our son just left for West Point, so we're adjusting to that. I was planning on taking Susan out this weekend to celebrate our 15th anniversary." "Married for 15 years?" Jake asked. "Congratulations." "Well, I didn't call you here to mess with you. It's not that I don't like you, I like you. I wanted to talk to you about my upcoming promotion. As you know, this only applies to you and Johnson. There are only 1 or 2 things the board needs before making a decision." "I see," I said. "And what does the board need?" "They want to know how flexible you are," Jake said. "How do you react to stressful situations? How far are you willing to go to achieve the company goals? Do you understand that when you become a manager, your workday will not end at 6, as it is now?" "I figured that was true, at least up to a point," I said. "Surely the board looked at my reviews, looked at my personal file." "Yes, of course they did," Jake said, "but they need more. They have to see for themselves how you can react under fire, so to speak." "Sorry, Mr. Turner, but I'm afraid I don't quite understand," I said. He smiled and took another sip of bourbon. "You will understand this, my boy," he said. "Tell me, how strong is your marriage?" "Very solid, Mr. Turner," I said, taking another sip of my drink. "Why are you asking? Glad to hear it." "You see, I'm afraid you'll have to cancel your plans for the weekend," he said. "If your marriage is as strong as you say, I'm sure your wife will understand." He looked at Frank and nodded slightly. Frank walked to the other door, opened it, and came back to stand behind my chair. I felt a little uncomfortable about this and wondered what was going to happen. Then I saw another guard, Bob Jones, come through the door, but he was not alone. Susan was with him. He led her to Turner and stepped back. I was shocked by what I saw. Susan was wearing a very short dress with an open back. The front of her dress was open all the way to her waist, and it was clear that she wasn't wearing a bra. The hem of the dress fell just a couple of inches below her butt. She looked in my direction, but did not seem to recognize me. I looked at her face and saw her eyes. She appeared to be drugged, and I thought I saw something white in one nostril. "Susan," I said, "what are you doing here? Why are you dressed like that?" She looked at me but didn't answer. Her eyes appeared glassy, and it was obvious that she had been drugged. I looked back at Turner. "What does all of this mean?" I asked. "Why is she here in this outfit? She's clearly drugged. What did you give her?" He laughed at my question. "Come on, Jim," he said. "You are a clever boy. What do you think she's doing here? And yes, I gave her something. Something I prepared myself. Makes them hot, wet, and pliable. Keeps them in this state for a very long time. I even gave her 3 times the usual dose." He nodded to Bob, who untied the strip of fabric from the back of her neck. When he released her, her breasts were exposed. Turner reached out and pinched one of her breasts. Susan didn't answer. I started to get up, but found that I could not move my arms or legs. What the hell? I thought, and then it dawned on me. Frank had also slipped something into my drink. But what? Turner looked at me with an evil grin on his face. He looked back at Bob, who was standing behind Susan, and nodded his head. Bob unzipped her dress, and it fell to the floor. Apart from her high heels, Susan was now completely naked. She still didn't move. "I prefer my women to be shaved," he said. "Aren't you?" "She's not your woman," I said angrily. "Oh, now I see that you are starting to worry," he said. "And we're just getting started." He extended his hand and ran his finger over her butt. "Get the hell away from my wife!" I blurted out in rage as Frank held me back with both hands. Turner looked at me and laughed. "Or what?" he asked threateningly. "Will you kick my ass? If I haven't made a mistake in my calculations, you can't even move right now. Get away from her, you son of a bitch," I growled. Turner laughed again and unzipped his pants. He dropped his trousers and boxers and motioned for Bob to come over. The big man pushed Susan to her knees in front of Turner. That's when she began to satisfy him, and then they had sex. Her eyes remained glazed over as she moaned in pleasure. It was as if nothing else mattered to her, and nothing else existed in her universe at this point. I was shaking with rage, fighting to free myself from Frank, but I still couldn't move my arms. I looked back at Turner. "I'm going to kill you, you son of a bitch," I shouted. Turner just looked at me with a smirk. "Well, is it really possible to talk to your own flesh and blood like that?" he asked. "Such language, and in front of your dear, sweet wife. She won't be my wife for long," I said angrily. "And what do you mean by flesh and blood?" "Oh, you mean no one ever told you?" he asked. "Told me what?" I answered. "How did my father knock up your biological mother in front of her husband?" Turner said with a grin. "That's right, Wilson. You and I are half-brothers." "That's not true," I said, shocked. "Why are you doing it?" "Actually, for several reasons," he said. "Firstly, because I am the general director and I can do whatever I want. Call it executive privilege if you want. Secondly, I always wanted to cuckold my younger half-brother. You don't think I brought you on board because of your grades or abilities, do you?" "You mean," I began. "That's right, Wilson," he said. "I knew your biological mother's husband when he worked here for my father. At that time, I was a young man who had not even finished high school. I worked here during the summers and weekends, mostly in the post office. I worked my way up the ranks, and now I occupy the position that my father once had. I kept an eye on you, and when I saw that you graduated from college, I made it clear that if you applied for a job here, you would be hired." "Have you been planning this all along?" I asked. "Of course," he said. "I call it the long game. I knew this time would come. It was just a matter of time. And now your ass belongs to me, and your wife belongs to me. This brings me to the third reason I do this. I intend to return what was taken from my father." "What do you mean, taken from your father?" I asked. "I've never met your father." "No, but the man you call Dad did it," Turner said. "He sued my father and the company. Where do you think the money for your trust fund came from? Now I intend to take back what is mine, and I'm going to take it out of your wife's ass." "You're sick, you know that?" I asked. He shrugged. "Maybe," he said. "It is what it is." So here's how it's going to work, Jim. You are not going to divorce your wife. She will need extra money to support her new lifestyle. As I said, she belongs to me now. She will become my personal corporate sex toy, and you will never touch her again. She should be available to me upon request, 247. In fact, I'm taking her to Miami for a couple of days to present her to the board of directors. They also showed interest in her. Don't worry, I'll bring her back. Maybe a little shabby. You'll never get away with this, I said. He laughed. I've already done it, he said, and there's not a damn thing you can do to stop me. He looked at Bob and nodded his head. Bob stood in front of me and grinned. It's nothing personal, Mr. Wilson, he said. I've always liked you. I'm just doing my job. With these words, he hit me hard in the face. I saw stars and finally lost consciousness after the third blow. I woke up and immediately realized that I was in a hospital room. I heard buzzing and beeping sounds from the instruments attached to me and saw the plastic IV that was in my arm. My mouth was dry and my head hurt terribly. I looked around and saw my dad sitting on the chair next to my bed. He heard me move and looked at me. He looked like he hadn't slept in forever. He saw that I was trying to speak and called the nurse. A young woman in a nurse's uniform entered the room and checked my vital signs before giving me a piece of ice to suck on. She gave me another one after the first one melted. After eating a couple more cubes, I licked my lips and tried to speak. How long? I asked. You've been here about 3 days, Dad said, as the nurse left the room to call the doctor. 3 days? I asked in shock. That means it's Monday, said my father. I got a call from the hospital late on Friday evening. They said you were dumped in front of the emergency room. You haven't been home since then. What happened to you, son? Later, I said, seeing the doctor enter my room. Good afternoon, Mr. Wilson. I'm Dr. Carter, he said. I'm glad to see you with us again. How do you feel? Like I was run over by a truck, I said. Everything hurts. I have no doubt about it, he said. You've been pretty beat up. Nothing is broken, but you have a couple of bruised ribs and a small bruise. We were concerned that you might have had a concussion. He examined me and made notes on my chart. We're going to take some x-rays, and I want to keep you one more night for observation. If everything goes well, we can send you home tomorrow. I took it upon myself to call the police, my dad said. It was very clear to me that you were under attack, and we have a responsibility to report possible criminal activity. I know they want to talk to you. Do you think you can handle this? Yes, doctor, I said. Most definitely. Okay, he said. I'll call them and maybe they'll be here by the time you get back. He waved to the nurse and she called for the X-ray technician. A few minutes later, I was taken to radiology for an X-ray. When I returned to my room, a man in a suit was talking to my father. After I settled in, the man in the suit pulled out a set of ID cards and introduced himself. Mr. Wilson, I'm Detective Ryan Blackwell, he said. Can you tell us how this happened? Yes, I can, I told him, taking a sip of water. I told him everything I could. Then I remembered my phone. Did you find my phone? I asked my father. Yes, he said. Your mother brought the charger and plugged it into the outlet. I thought you might need this. He turned off the phone, which was lying on the table next to my bed, and handed it to me. I noticed there were a few text messages from a couple of numbers I didn't recognize and decided to check them later. I found the audio recording I had recorded and played it back for the detective. We could hear everything, including the blows on my body. I paid special attention to what happened after my beating. Okay, get him out of here, we heard Turner say to the two guards. Take him out the back door and take him to the hospital. If anyone asks, just say that's how you found him. Got it? Got it, boss, I heard Bob's voice. We heard movement, probably from the guards who were dragging me. Then we heard them talking as they pushed me into the back seat of the car. Careful, Frank said. I don't want to get blood on the seats. I'm trying, but he's such a son of a bitch, Bob said. Aren't they all like that? Frank said, laughing. We heard the door slam, then the recording ended. We have video from the hospital security system, Ryan said. According to this, they drove up, opened the door, and threw you into the parking lot before driving away. A couple of EMTs saw you lying there and took you inside. We were able to see the car's license plate. It's registered to Harris Industries. I called your HR department on Monday morning to let them know where you were, and they told me that Turner already said you'd be on sick leave for a week. Any news from Susan? I asked. Dad shook his head. No, son, he said. None. I've been trying to call you at home and on her cell phone ever since I got the call from the hospital. I left voicemails but never heard from her. She's probably still in Miami. I said. God only knows what they're doing to her. I will put her on the wanted list, a bulletin on all counts, Ryan said. Do you have a recent photograph of her? Yes, there is, I said, pulling out my photograph. Okay, he said. Send this to me along with a copy of that audio recording. I will send the photo to the NYPD and ask them to do the same. I will also issue a warrant for the arrest of Turner and his thugs and forward it to the NYPD. I assume you want us to press charges? Absolutely, I said. Okay, he said. Then we'll figure it out ourselves, Mr. Wilson. You just relax and let the professionals do their job, okay? Okay, detective, I said. Thank you. Well, be in touch, Ryan said. We may have some questions later. He pulled out a business card and handed it to me. Call me if you remember anything else. After he left, I looked at my father. Is what Turner said true? I asked. Yes and no, said Dad. It's true that his father had his way with your biological mother, and it's true that he made me watch. But it turned out that your mother was already pregnant when this happened. She just didn't know it at the time. What happened? I asked. Well, after that happened, I filed for divorce, he said. She kept telling me it was just a mistake, that she still loved me, all that usual nonsense, but I wasn't going to hear it. I moved into the guest bedroom and refused to have anything to do with her. I also filed an alienation of affection lawsuit against Turner and the company for allowing this to happen. In those days, I could still do it. Soon after, she found out she was pregnant, and the court forced us to wait until you were born before moving forward. Could you do a DNA test? I asked. You were born in 1986, said Dad. This was before they used DNA to establish paternity. We took blood tests, but they were inconclusive. It turns out that you, me, your biological mother, and Turner have the same blood type. I won't bore you with all the details, but things in the house only got worse. Your biological mother began to abuse alcohol and drugs. She died of an overdose about 6 months after you were born. Damn, I said. The lawsuit against Turner and Harris continued, and we settled it out of court, my father said. That's where I got the money to start your trust fund. As part of the agreement, I agreed not to disclose any details about this case. That's why I couldn't tell you anything. About a year after all this, I met Patricia. She fell in love with you the moment she saw you for the first time and insisted on adopting you after we got married. She could not have children of her own, but in her opinion, you were and remain her son. So how did you know that I was really your son? I asked. Do you remember that motorcycle accident you had when you were 15? He asked. I remembered it too well. One day I was riding on the back of Billy Johnson's bike. He was usually very careful, but that day he hit a slippery spot on the road, and we fell. Fortunately, we were both wearing helmets, and this saved our lives. However, I was still pretty beat up. Yes, I remember, I said. Well, I asked the hospital to do a DNA test, he said. I just had to find out the truth one way or another. The test came back and showed that there is more than a 99% chance that I am your father. This means that your biological mother was already pregnant with you when Turner had her. Well, as far as I am concerned, you are my father no matter what any test shows, I told him, making him smile. What happened to Turner? I asked. He died of a stroke around the time you went to college, Dad said. His son took a step forward and became general director. I had hoped that the younger Turner had learned from his father's mistakes, but it appears I was wrong. That's why you weren't particularly enthusiastic about me going there to work, isn't it? I asked. He nodded his head. Yes, he said. I wanted to tell you, but I couldn't. I prayed to God that I had this now. It's not your fault, Dad, I said. I just don't know how Susan could fall for his crap after all these years. It just doesn't make any sense. Who knows, said Dad. It looks like she was drugged and out of control. She may have been drugged, but something just doesn't sound right, I said. First of all, what was she doing there and wearing this dress? Just at that moment, we heard a knock on the door. Yes, I shouted. The door opened and Brenda poked her head into the room. Can I come in? She asked meekly. Of course, Brenda, I said. Come in. What do you want? In her hands, she held a vase full of flowers and a large card. I wanted to bring this, she said. Everyone in the office chipped in and bought it for you. They also signed the card. Thank you, Brenda, I said. Put the flowers over there, I added, pointing to the nightstand next to the bed. She handed me the card and placed the flowers on the nightstand. Then she turned to face me. I want you to know that I'm really sorry about all of this, she said. Did you know what Turner was planning to do? I asked. I knew he was planning something with your wife, she said. I didn't know about this, she added, pointing at me. What happened? I asked. That morning he gave me a company credit card and told me to pick up your wife, she said. He said that she was waiting for me. He told me to take her out and buy her the shortest, sexiest dress we could find and take her downstairs to get her hair done. He also insisted that she wax her bikini area, a complete Brazilian wax. I had a pretty good idea of what he meant. This is not the first time he has done this. So your boss is using you to train his little girls? Dad asked. Brenda's face turned red, and she had the good sense to look down. Did you know that he drugged her? He drugs all the women he sleeps with, Mr. Wilson, she said. He loves to experiment. Has he ever used it on you? Dad asked. She nodded her head. One day, she said, he gave me just a little bit. He said it was only a quarter of the dose. Made me last an hour or so. Do you know how much he gave my wife? I asked. She shook her head. No, I don't know, she said. He said he gave Susan 3 times the usual dose, I said. Her eyes widened, and she brought her hands to her face. Oh my God, she said. I had no idea. Your poor wife must have been climbing the walls for hours. I bet she didn't even know you were in the room. This stuff really does good for you. When I walked into your office, you knew what was going to happen, didn't you? I asked. She nodded her head. I knew, she said, but I didn't know he was going to treat you so cruelly, honestly. Do you know where Turner and my wife are now? I asked. Last I heard, they're still in Miami, she said. Would you agree to talk to the police? Dad asked. I will do everything in my power to help, she said. She looked back at me with tears in her eyes. I'm really, really sorry about this, Mr. Wilson. Just one thing, Brenda, I said. What is this? She asked. Did my wife know what was going to happen? I asked. She nodded her head. I'm pretty sure she knew that, Mr. Wilson, she said. I know that Mr. Turner has spoken to her several times over the last month or so, and he has asked her out to dinner several times, long lunches. I don't know if they did anything or not, and he never told me. But do you think they did it? I asked. I would say it's very likely, but I really don't know, she said. You often do things like this for Turner, don't you? Dad asked. Quite often, she said quietly. So you approve of his actions? He asked. She shook her head. You don't understand, she said. I'm a single mother with a special needs child, and Mr. Turner pays me quite well for my help and my silence. Well, your silence is what got my son into the hospital this time, young lady, he said, starting to lose his temper. She backed away as he glared at her. Honestly, Mr. Wilson, she said, I didn't know they were going to harm your son. I would have warned him if I had known. Dad leaned back in his chair and looked at her without saying anything. Brenda, I'll have the police detective contact you about this, I said. I suggest you be available and cooperate fully, you understand? She nodded her head. I understand, Mr. Wilson, she said. Okay, I said, and tell everyone that I thanked you for the flowers and the card. I'll do so, she said, wiping a tear from her eye. Once again, I apologize. With these words, she turned and left the room. After the door closed, I turned and looked at my father. That explains something, I said. Susan has been acting a little strange since school ended. At first, I thought it was just because Eric had gone to West Point. Well, we'll get to the bottom of it, he said. There was another knock on the door, and a hospital orderly entered, wheeling a cart full of food. Dad smiled and stood up. Looks like it's time for dinner, he said. That means I better get home before your mother sends the National Guard to find me, he joked. Take care of yourself, son. Get some rest, and we'll see you in the morning. Thank you, Dad, I said. Tell Mom hello from me, and be sure to tell her that I love her. I'll do it, son, he said. And by the way, I love you too. He smiled as we bumped fists and then left the room. The orderly smiled at Dad as he left, then placed my food on the tray. It actually smelled pretty good, and I was a little hungry since it had been a few days since I last ate. I wolfed down my food, enjoying the meatloaf and mashed potatoes. I especially liked the mushroom sauce. It wasn't up to Mom's or Susan's standards, but it did the job. I even liked the broccoli, which I don't usually eat. I had finished my pudding cup and was sipping my coffee when I decided to check the text messages on my phone. There were 4 messages in total, and each of them had a video attached. The first message, dated later that Friday, simply read, "Enjoy. I bet you wish you weren't here." I didn't recognize the number and opened the video. I immediately regretted doing it. The video began with Susan standing in front of a group of grinning men wearing the same short dress she was wearing the last time I saw her. I recognized these men as members of the board of directors. This would only add millions to the lawsuit, I thought to myself. She stood silently as one of the men reached out, tore off her dress, and threw it on the floor. She began to satisfy the man. I saw that Susan's eyes were still glazed over, and I knew that she was under the influence of what Turner had given her. I didn't know if it was because of what he gave her on Friday afternoon or if he gave her another dose. Luckily, the video ended because I felt like I was going to throw up. Gathering my courage, I opened the next message, dated early Saturday morning, and played the video. And again, I regretted doing this. In this video, Susan was having fun with several men at the same time. The third video, from late Saturday night, showed Susan lying on her back with her legs spread wide open, and several men had sex with her. The fourth video was different. The video, dated early Sunday morning, showed Turner and Susan looking directly into the camera. I noticed that her eyes were bloodshot, and there were large dark bags underneath them. I wondered how long they had been tormenting her, I thought. Turner spoke first. "I hope you liked what you saw, cuckold," he said. "This is your wife's new life, so you better get used to it." He turned to Susan before speaking again. "Tell that bastard who I am, honey," he said. "Jake Turner is my master," she said in a voice devoid of emotion. "That's true," he said. "And what's your new job?" Turner asked. "I am my master's sex toy," she said. "I do sex with whomever he says, whenever he says, and however he says, as much as he says." "Very good," said Jake. "And tell that bastard that he will never touch you again." "You cuckold," Susan said, pointing her finger at the camera. "You'll never be able to touch me again." Turner laughed at that before looking into the camera. "And remember, don't rock the boat, or the next time I ask Frank and Bob to talk to you, you might not wake up. See you later, cuckold. Bye. This video ends." I experienced a whole range of emotions: hatred, anger, sadness, disappointment. I couldn't believe what I just saw and heard. As far as I could tell, he was able to get her. I looked at the wedding ring on my finger. It no longer had any meaning to me, so I took it off and threw it on the nightstand. Maybe, I thought, I could sell it and get a few dollars for it at a pawn shop. At that moment, I had no doubt that I would divorce Susan. I really didn't care if Jake liked it or not. I also intended to make him pay, but how? Alienation of affection lawsuits were possible when my father filed for divorce, but no more. I wanted to kill that bastard, but honestly, he wasn't worth going to jail for. I called Ryan and told him about the videos and Turner's threats. He asked me to forward them to him and said he would contact me. I followed his instructions and turned off my phone. I thought about calling Susan, but I decided that would be a futile exercise. I put my phone on the nightstand and watched some TV to take my mind off what I had just seen. Eventually, I fell asleep and dreamed of happier times when I had a loving and faithful wife. The next morning, I woke up to the sounds of nurses in my room checking my vital signs and looking at the monitors. Two of them took me to the radiology department and took some more x-rays and then took me back to my room. After they got me back on my feet, the orderly brought breakfast. Dr. Carter came into my room shortly after I had finished my bacon and egg breakfast and told me the good news. "Everything has gone well," Dr. Carter said, "and you can go home. I'll write a prescription for the pain and give you a series of instructions. The discharge paperwork will take about an hour, so why don't you call your parents and ask them to come pick you up?" "Thanks, Doc," I said. "I'll do that." After he left, I called my parents and told them the good news. About an hour later, they appeared in my room. Mom hugged me. She looked at me, and I saw tears in her eyes. "Oh, Jim, I'm so sorry this happened to you," she said. "How do you feel?" "I've been better, Mom," I told her. "Well, I made some of my lasagna for you and put it in the oven to keep it warm," she said. I really like my mother's lasagna. It was the most delicious, with several layers of cheese and mushroom and meat filling. It was the most delicious food in the world. I looked at her and smiled. "Thank you, Mom," I said. "I appreciate it. Your lasagna always brings a smile to my face." "I'm glad, son," she said. "Your father told me what happened, and I feel so bad. I have every reason to throw this woman over my knee and whip her ass." Dad and I looked at each other and laughed. I had no doubt that she would have thrown Susan over her knee if she had been here. So, is there any news? Dad asked. I told him about the videos and Turner's threat. Video? Mom asked. Trust me, Mom. You really don't want to see them, I said. They are worse than bad. I understand. You'll need the name of a good divorce lawyer, Dad said. Yes, I said. I don't see any way to forget what she did, which she's probably still doing. I also need to tell Eric. He will be heartbroken. Okay, I'll make a few calls, Dad said. Just then, a nurse came into the room and handed me discharge papers and instructions. They insisted that I ride in a wheelchair, so the nurse sat me down and wheeled me around while Mom and Dad walked next to me. We got to the loading dock, and I climbed into the back seat. Dad drove us back to my house, stopping at a pharmacy along the way so I could buy my pain pills. I noticed my car was parked in the driveway when we pulled up. Your mom and I picked up your car from Harris on Saturday, Dad said. Susan's car is still in the garage. We stopped and entered the house. I looked around and realized how empty the place seemed without Susan. I smelled lasagna in the oven, and it cheered me up a bit. I hope you don't mind, but yesterday afternoon I took the liberty of freshening things up a little, Mom said. It was starting to get a little musty. I don't mind at all, Mom, I told her. Thank you for all your help. I think I can handle all of this. Just at that moment, we noticed a dark sedan parked in front of the house. I saw Ryan get out on the driver's side and another man in a suit get out on the passenger side. I opened the door and invited them in. Detective Blackwell, I said, please come inside. I held the door open as the two men came inside. Ryan shook my hand as he entered. I introduced him to my parents, and they shook hands. Can I get you two something to drink? Mom asked. Coffee? Coca-Cola? Ryan shook his head. No, ma'am, but thank you anyway, Ryan said. He turned to the other man. Mr. Wilson, this is Detective Hawthorne from the NYPD Homicide Department. I was shocked for a moment when I realized this, but eventually extended my hand. Hawthorne accepted it. I invited them to sit down, and we all made ourselves as comfortable as we could. Homicide? I asked. Hawthorne nodded his head and held out a photograph. Can you identify the woman in this photograph? He asked. I looked up and saw Susan's face, but her eyes were closed, and her skin had a sickly tint. That sounds like my wife, Susan, I said, but she was alive early Sunday morning. I have a video. Did your wife have any marks or tattoos? Asked Hawthorne. Yes, she had a tattoo of a small dolphin on her upper right thigh, I said. She did it on a dare 10 years ago. Hawthorne looked at Ryan and nodded his head before looking back at me. I'm sorry to tell you, Mr. Wilson, but it appears that your wife may have been murdered, he said. Killed? I asked. How? When? That's what we're trying to determine, Mr. Wilson, he said. The coroner is still examining her, but his initial assessment was that she died of a massive heart attack. That wouldn't make her death a murder, would it? I asked. Well, her body was found in a shallow grave in the middle of Central Park yesterday afternoon, Hawthorne said. In my experience, this usually indicates murder. We're still waiting on toxicology test results, and maybe that will shed some light on what happened. What can you tell us? I told them both the whole story. Ryan listened and took notes, even though he had heard it all before. I pulled out my phone and let them listen to the audio recording, then I played the video for them. Mom didn't hear or see anything and started crying. Dad took her out of the room so I could talk to the detectives alone. When they finished watching the video, I told them what Brenda told me. They both made notes and looked at each other before turning to me. That explains the bruises and general condition of Mrs. Wilson's body, said Hawthorne. He turned to me. This woman, Brenda Harris, is she working today? As far as I know, I said. We need to talk to her, Hawthorne said to Ryan, who nodded his head in agreement. He turned to me again. What can you tell me about the drugs Turner mentioned? Is this the so-called super ecstasy? He asked. Not much, just what Brenda told me and what I saw, I said. Doc said that what they used on me was already out of my body. What about Turner and his goons? Ryan asked. It's one of those things we were hoping you could tell us, Ryan said. Turner's corporate jet took off from Miami last night. According to the flight plan filed by its pilot, they were returning here, but there is no record of the plane landing here. Do you know where else he could have gone? Harris has branches all over the country, I said. He could be anywhere. Great, Hawthorne said, looking at Ryan. We will need to get the FAA involved as well as the FBI. I have a contact at the local FAA office, Ryan said. We can go there after we execute a search warrant on Harris. Hawthorne nodded his head. What is going to happen? I asked. If what you're telling us is true, this could become a federal case because Turner took your wife across state lines, Ryan said. We're looking at several charges against him, including murder and possibly kidnapping. In the meantime, said Hawthorne, my men will complete their work and free your wife's body. This may take several days. We will also detain the people in this video and see what we can show them. I nodded my head in understanding. Ryan looked at Hawthorne before speaking. I'd like to speak to Mr. Wilson alone if you don't mind, he said. Hawthorne looked at me and nodded his head. Of course I understand, he said. I still need to make a couple of calls. I'll be right outside. He looked at me before continuing. I'm really sorry about all this, Mr. Wilson, he told me. Thank you, Detective, I said, shaking his hand. After he left, Ryan turned back to me. Mr. Wilson, Jim, he began, I wanted to talk to you a little about what happened to your wife, and I wanted to do it in private. I appreciate it, Ryan, I said. I'll spare you the gory details, Ryan said, but from what I've read and seen, her last 48 hours were absolute hell. I spoke to a medical examiner in the East, and he confirmed my suspicions. I don't believe your wife agreed with what was done to her. I believe she was brutally attacked. She was used and abused by a bunch of power-mad animals. Look, Ryan, I understand what you're trying to do here, and I appreciate it, I said. I really understand, but the truth is that Susan and Turner dated for a month before this happened. I don't know exactly what happened between them, but I have a pretty good idea. Susan could have stopped all of this any time before last Friday, but she didn't. I don't know why she did what she did, and now I'll never know. I understand, Ryan said quietly. He pulled out a business card from his pocket and handed it to me. I think you should consult Dr. Harmon. She's one of the best in the business. Call her, okay? I'll do that. Thank you, I said. I'm worried that Turner's thugs will come back for you, he said. I would assign a couple of officers to you, but I'm afraid we simply don't have the manpower for this. However, I will order the dispatcher to double patrols in your area. Do you have a gun? No, I said. He nodded his head. Okay, he said. Then always keep your windows and doors closed and locked. If you suspect anything, call 911 immediately. I'll do that, Ryan, I said. Just at that moment, Hawthorne returned to the house. I just got off the phone with your partner, Johnson, he said. He is wanted throughout the country and also received search warrants and is waiting for us. Ryan nodded his head and stood up. Well, be in touch, Jim, Ryan said, shaking my hand. Hawthorne extended his hand. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Wilson, he said. Thank you, Detective, I said. They both nodded their heads and walked out the front door. I was standing there trying to make sense of everything that had just happened when I felt my mother's arms wrap around me. She must have come back while we were talking. It'll be okay, honey, she said. We'll get through this. Thank you, Mom, I said. I really appreciate your help. She hugged me tightly before turning to go back to the kitchen. I'll get you a plate of lasagna, she said. I bet you're starving. I smiled and nodded my head. Thanks, Mom, I said. I really appreciate it. Dad walked into the kitchen and poured himself a cup of coffee. Well, it looks like we're going to have a busy couple of days, he said. Yes, Dad, I said, but I'm going to get through this. I'll make Turner pay for what he did. I believe in you, son, he said, and I'll do everything I can to help you. I know, Dad, I said, thank you. He nodded his head and patted me on the back. You're welcome, Jim, he said. Now let's eat. Your mom's lasagna is getting cold. We sat down at the table, and Mom served us all. As I ate, I thought about everything that had happened. I knew that my life would never be the same again, but I was determined to move forward and make Turner pay for what he did. I didn't know exactly how I would do it, but I knew I wouldn't stop until justice was served. After lunch, I decided to go through some of Susan's things. I wanted to see if there was any clue as to why she had done what she did. I started with her phone. It was locked, but I knew her passcode and unlocked it. I went through her text messages and emails and found several conversations between her and Turner. They were filled with flirtatious messages and plans to meet. My heart sank as I read them, realizing how deeply she had betrayed me. Next, I went through her computer. I found more emails and messages between her and Turner, as well as photos of them together. Some of the photos were taken at our house, which made me feel even more betrayed. I couldn't believe she had brought him into our home. I continued to search through her things and found a hidden folder on her computer. It was filled with explicit photos and videos of Susan and Turner. I felt sick to my stomach as I watched them. It was clear that she had been involved with him for much longer than I had thought. I copied everything onto a flash drive and handed it to my dad. "This is evidence," I said. "Give it to Ryan. It should help build the case against Turner." Dad nodded his head and took the flash drive. "I'll take care of it, son," he said. "You just focus on getting better." "Thanks, Dad," I said. "I will." Over the next few days, I tried to come to terms with everything that had happened. I knew that I needed to be strong and move forward with my life. I couldn't let Turner's actions destroy me. I filed for divorce and started working with a lawyer to make sure everything was in order. I also began seeing Dr. Harmon, who helped me process my emotions and start to heal. One evening, about a week after I was discharged from the hospital, I received a call from Ryan. "We got him," he said. "Turner was arrested earlier today. He's being held without bail." "That's great news," I said. "Thank you, Ryan." "You're welcome," he said. "We'll keep you updated on the case." I hung up the phone and felt a sense of relief wash over me. Turner was finally going to face justice for what he had done. Over the next few months, I focused on rebuilding my life. I spent time with my parents and friends, and I threw myself into my work. I knew that I couldn't change what had happened, but I could control how I responded to it. I also decided to sell the house. There were too many painful memories there, and I wanted a fresh start. I found a nice apartment in the city and moved in. One day, I received a call from Brenda. "Mr. Wilson," she said, "I just wanted to let you know that I quit my job at Harris Industries. I couldn't work for a company that allowed such horrible things to happen." "I understand, Brenda," I said. "Thank you for letting me know. I hope you find a job that makes you happy." "Thank you, Mr. Wilson," she said, "and I'm truly sorry for everything that happened." "Thank you, Brenda," I said. "Take care." As I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of closure. I knew that I had a long road ahead of me, but I was determined to move forward and build a better life for myself. Turner's trial was a long and grueling process, but in the end, he was found guilty on multiple charges, including kidnapping and murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Seeing him finally brought to justice gave me a sense of peace. I continued to see Dr. Harmon, who helped me work through my emotions and start to heal. I also reconnected with old friends and made new ones, slowly rebuilding my social life. As time went on, I found myself thinking less and less about Susan and Turner. I knew that I would never forget what had happened, but I was determined not to let it define me. Eventually, I met someone new. Her name was Emily, and she was kind, understanding, and supportive. We took things slow, but over time, our relationship grew stronger. She helped me see that there was still good in the world and that I deserved to be happy. Looking back, I realized that the ordeal had made me stronger. It had taught me the importance of standing up for myself and not letting anyone take advantage of me. It had also shown me the value of true friends and family. Thank you for watching this heartbreaking story. If you found it compelling, please hit the like button and subscribe for more real-life tales of betrayal and revenge. What would you do if you were in Jim's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.